"Look at this," Margaret said, sliding the photograph across the kitchen table to her husband, James. "My mother mentioned this portrait once, but I've never actually seen it." James adjusted his reading glasses and studied the formal arrangement of somber faces. Quite the distinguished bunch, weren't they? Boston Brahmins through and through. The portrait showed 11 people arranged in 3 rows. The patriarch, William Thorndike, stood centre back, his hand resting on the shoulder of his wife, Eleanor. Surrounding them were their 6 children, ranging from young adults to a small boy of perhaps 5 or 6. The family's 2 household staff members stood slightly apart, and an elderly woman, presumably a grandmother, sat in a chair at the front. "I never realized how wealthy they were," Margaret murmured, tracing the elegant details of the women's clothing with her fingertip. "Look at those pearl necklaces, the tailored suits. Who's this little boy?" James asked, pointing to a child standing slightly apart from the others. "Something about him seems off." Margaret leaned closer, squinting. The boy's face appeared unnaturally pale, almost grey compared to the others. His eyes seemed hollow, his expression vacant, while everyone else maintained the serious, composed expressions typical of period photography. "That must be Edward," Margaret replied. "My grandmother's youngest brother. I don't know much about him. Family never spoke of him." James reached for his phone. "Let me take a picture of this. I can enlarge it on the computer." Later that evening, James called Margaret to his study. "You need to see this," he said, his voice strained. On his computer screen was the enlarged image of young Edward. What had seemed merely unusual in the original photograph was now disturbingly clear. The boy's skin had an unnatural, mottled appearance. His eyes weren't just hollow. They appeared sunken and dark-rimmed. His lips had a bluish tint. "My God," Margaret whispered, "he looks dead." "Oh, post-mortem photography was common then," James suggested reluctantly. "Families would pose their deceased loved ones for one final portrait." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, that's not possible. My grandmother mentioned Edward dying during the influenza pandemic, but that was in 1918. This photo is from 1924. "Then why does he look like a corpse?" James asked quietly. Margaret stared at the haunting image, noticing another disturbing detail. While the other family members were either looking directly at the camera or at each other, no one, not a single person, was looking at Edward. "I need to call my mother," Margaret said, a chill creeping up her spine. "Do you remember this family portrait, Mom?" Margaret asked gently. Ruth's arthritic fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her glasses. When she looked at the photograph, her expression changed immediately. The warm smile vanished, replaced by a tightness around her mouth. "Where did you find this?" Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In Grandma Elizabeth's attic, in a box with some other old papers." Margaret pointed to the boy with the corpse-like appearance. "That's Edward, isn't it? Your uncle who died in the influenza pandemic?" Ruth didn't answer immediately. She stared at the photograph, her breath becoming shallow. Finally she looked up, her eyes clouded with what Margaret recognized as fear. "We were told never to speak of this picture," Ruth said. "Your grandmother forbade it." "Why? What happened to Edward?" Ruth glanced toward the door as if worried someone might be listening. "Edward died in 1918, just as you said. He was only 5 years old. The Spanish flu took him within days." "But this picture was taken in 1924, Margaret pressed, 6 years after he died." "Yes," Ruth's voice quavered. "That's what makes it so wrong." Margaret felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. "I don't understand." "Neither did they," Ruth replied. "When they developed the photograph, everyone was shocked to see Edward standing there. No one remembered him being present when the picture was taken. No one saw him." James, who had been quietly listening, leaned forward. "Are you saying the boy appeared in the photograph, but wasn't actually there when it was taken?" Ruth nodded slowly. The photographer swore no tricks were involved. He was nearly ruined by the scandal, accused of doctoring the image. but multiple people confirmed the negative showed the same thing. That's impossible, Margaret said. Within 3 months of that photograph being taken, 3 people in it were dead, Ruth continued, her finger shakily pointing to Eleanor Thorndyke, the elderly grandmother, and one of the older sons. All from different causes: pneumonia, heart failure, an automobile accident. The family became convinced that Edward had come back to collect them. Margaret felt goosebumps rising on her arms despite the warm room. Grandfather William eventually took the negative and all prints from the photographer and burned them. Or so he thought. Ruth tapped the photograph with a gnarled finger. This must have been hidden away. It should have stayed hidden. Mom, you don't actually believe. What I believe doesn't matter, Ruth interrupted sharply. What matters is what happened next. After the deaths, my mother, your grandmother Elizabeth, was plagued by dreams of Edward standing at the foot of her bed. Just standing, watching. She would wake up screaming night after night. Ruth pushed the photograph back toward Margaret. Destroy it. Burn it like William should have done with all of them. But it's a family heirloom, Margaret protested. Ruth's eyes hardened. It's not an heirloom, it's a curse. The photograph lay on the counter where she'd left it. In the dim light of the range hood, the sepia tones looked darker, the shadows more pronounced. Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat staring at the family portrait. This is ridiculous, she muttered to herself. Ghost stories and superstitions. Yet she couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled over her since enlarging Edward's image. She picked up her phone and took another photograph of the portrait, then zoomed in on the faces one by one. Something caught her attention that she hadn't noticed before. The patriarch, William Thorndyke, had his hand on his wife's shoulder, but his fingers were digging in so tightly that the fabric of her dress was bunched unnaturally. His knuckles appeared white with tension, and his eyes. Margaret zoomed in further. William wasn't looking straight ahead as she'd initially thought. His eyes were shifted slightly to the side, toward where Edward stood. Margaret felt her heart rate quicken. She moved to the other faces, examining each closely. The elderly grandmother's hands were clenched in her lap, not resting peacefully as formal portraits typically showed. One of the older daughters had tears visible in her eyes, and the household staff, their expressions weren't just solemn but terrified. They had seen him. They had all seen Edward standing there, despite what Ruth had said. A sudden noise from upstairs made Margaret jump, spilling tea across the counter. She quickly mopped it up with a dishcloth, her hands shaking. Just James turning over in bed, she told herself. As she cleaned, her elbow knocked against a small family photo in a frame, a recent Christmas picture of herself, James, and their 2 adult children. The frame toppled, and the glass cracked as it hit the counter. "Damn it," Margaret whispered, carefully picking up the broken frame. As she lifted it, her blood froze in her veins. Where her son Daniel's face had been, there was now a blurry smudge. Margaret dropped the frame with a clatter and grabbed her phone, frantically opening her photo gallery. She found the original digital photo from Christmas. Daniel was there, smiling normally between his sister and father. She looked back at the broken frame. The smudge remained where Daniel's face should be. With trembling fingers, Margaret dialed Daniel's number. It was late, past midnight, but she had to hear his voice. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. "Daniel, it's Mom. Call me as soon as you get this. It's important." She tried again immediately, straight to voicemail this time. Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. Daniel lived in Chicago, 1,000 miles away. He could be asleep, his phone on silent. There could be dozens of innocent explanations, or something could be terribly wrong. She was about to wake James when her phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel. "Mom, it's 1 a.m. Everything okay? Call in the morning." Relief washed over her like a wave. Margaret typed back quickly, "Sorry to wake you, just checking in. Love you." As she set down her phone, her eyes drifted back to the 1924 portrait and Edward's corpse-like face. A coincidence, she told herself. The glass breaking had damaged the modern photo. Nothing more. Yet as she finally headed back upstairs, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that by bringing this photograph into the light after all these years, she had awakened something that should have remained dormant. "I'm looking for information about the Thorndyke family," Margaret explained to the archivist, "particularly anything unusual around 1924. Several hours and dozens of microfilm reels later, Margaret sat back, rubbing her tired eyes. She'd found multiple mentions of the Thorndykes, charity events, business announcements, society pages, but nothing about a controversial family portrait or mysterious deaths. Just as she was about to give up, a small article from November 1924 caught her attention. "Thorndyke family mourns loss of matriarch." The piece mentioned Eleanor Thorndyke's unexpected death from pneumonia, noting that this tragedy follows the recent loss of Mrs. Abigail Thorndyke and comes 6 years after the family lost young Edward to influenza. Margaret continued searching and found 2 more obituaries, one for Abigail, the grandmother, and another for Richard Thorndyke, the eldest son, who had indeed died in an automobile accident in December 1924. 3 deaths within months of the photograph, just as Ruth had said. On her way out, Margaret passed the library's exhibit on early photography. She paused, then approached the curator who was arranging a display case. "Excuse me," Margaret said. "I have a question about post-mortem photography in the 1920s. The curator, a middle-aged woman with a streak of grey in her dark hair, looked up. "Interesting topic, though by the 1920s the practice was much less common than in the Victorian era. Was it possible to incorporate a deceased person's image into a family portrait after they had died?" The curator gave her an odd look. "There were crude attempts at double exposures, but nothing that would fool anyone. Photography then wasn't like Photoshop today." She paused. "May I ask why you're interested?" Margaret hesitated, then reached into her bag and produced the photograph, protected in an acid-free sleeve. "This family portrait shows my great-uncle, who had died 6 years before it was taken." The curator accepted the sleeve and examined the photograph carefully. Her professional demeanor faltered as she studied Edward's image. "This is unusual. Could it be some kind of trick? A double exposure or something?" "Not like this," the curator said, her voice lowered. "The lighting is consistent. There's no telltale haze around the boy that would indicate manipulation." She pointed to where Edward's shadow fell on the step. "See how his shadow aligns perfectly with the others? That would be nearly impossible to fake in 1924. Margaret felt a chill despite the library's warmth. "Then how do you explain it?" The curator handed back the photograph, her expression troubled. "I can't. Not technically." She hesitated before adding, "There are stories, of course. Photography has always had connections to the supernatural in people's minds, the ability to capture a moment in time, to preserve an image of the dead. It can feel like magic or something darker." "You don't really believe that." "What I believe doesn't matter," the curator said, unconsciously echoing Ruth's words. "But I've worked with historical photographs for 20 years, and occasionally I've seen things that defy explanation." As Margaret walked to her car, her phone rang. It was James. "Margaret, where are you?" His voice sounded strained. "At the library. What's wrong?" "It's Daniel. He's in the hospital. He collapsed at work this morning, some kind of seizure. They don't know what caused it. He's stable, but they're running tests." Margaret nearly dropped her phone, her mind immediately flashing to the blurred face in the broken picture frame. "I've booked us flights to Chicago," James continued. "We leave in 3 hours." Daniel lay propped up against pillows, looking pale but alert. Various monitors beeped softly beside his bed. Relief washed over Margaret as he smiled weakly at their entrance. "Mom, Dad, you didn't have to fly out here." Margaret embraced him carefully, mindful of the IV in his arm. "Of course we did. How are you feeling?" "Embarrassed, mostly," Daniel admitted. "Collapsing in the middle of a staff meeting isn't exactly career-enhancing." The doctor arrived shortly after, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Holloway's tests are still being processed, but preliminary results show no obvious cause for the seizure. No tumors, no signs of stroke. That's good news, right? James asked. It's encouraging, the doctor agreed. But unexplained neurological events still require thorough investigation. We'd like to keep him overnight for observation and more tests. After the doctor left, Daniel insisted his parents go to his apartment to rest. Seriously, I'm fine. They've got me on anti-seizure meds as a precaution. Get some sleep, come back tomorrow. And at Daniel's apartment, Margaret unpacked their hastily assembled overnight bags, while James ordered takeout. As she placed her toiletry bag on the bathroom counter, her gaze fell on Daniel's medicine cabinet, slightly ajar. Something compelled her to open it fully. Inside were the usual items: deodorant, shaving cream, aspirin, but also several prescription bottles. Margaret picked one up. Clonazepam, prescribed 3 months ago. Another was for trazodone, both psychiatric medications. "James!" she called, her voice tight with worry. She showed him the medications. "Did you know Daniel was being treated for anxiety and depression?" James shook his head, his expression troubled. He never mentioned anything. That night, after a quiet meal neither of them truly tasted, Margaret lay awake on Daniel's sofa bed. James had fallen into an exhausted sleep beside her, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She thought about the photograph, about Edward's corpse-like face, about Daniel's unexplained collapse and hidden medications. Her phone glowed in the darkness as she pulled up the picture she'd taken of the 1924 portrait. She zoomed in on Edward's face, studying those hollow eyes and grey skin. Then she scrolled through her recent photos until she found one of Daniel from their last family gathering. She placed the images side by side. There was no real resemblance. Daniel had Margaret's round face and James's straight nose. Edward had been a thin-faced child with sharp features, and yet something about the eyes. Both had the same deep-set eyes with prominent brows. A text message notification broke her concentration. An unknown number. "Stop looking!" Margaret's heart thundered in her chest. She sat up, suddenly aware of how dark the apartment was, how quiet. The message had to be a wrong number, a coincidence. Another message appeared. "You're waking him up." Margaret shook James roughly. "James, wake up. Someone's sending me threatening texts." James fumbled for his glasses, blinking in confusion as Margaret showed him the messages. "Block the number," he advised. "It's probably just spam." "At 2 a.m.? Specifically mentioning what I'm doing?" James frowned, now fully awake. "Call the police then." Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture message. A photograph of herself and James sleeping on the sofa bed, clearly taken from the doorway of Daniel's living room just minutes earlier. "We'll patrol the area," the female officer assured them, "but honestly, this sounds like some kind of prank or technical glitch. These apps have all kinds of vulnerabilities." After they left, neither Margaret nor James could go back to sleep. They sat at Daniel's kitchen table, mugs of coffee cooling between them. "We should tell Daniel about the texts," James said. "He might know who could have access to his apartment." Margaret nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. "I'm going to call my cousin Patricia. Her husband teaches American history at Boston College. He might know something about the Thorndikes that didn't make the newspapers." James gave her a long look. "Margaret, I'm concerned about these connections you're making. Daniel having a seizure is frightening, but it has nothing to do with an old photograph. What about the picture from last night? Someone was in this apartment while we slept, James. Or someone hacked Daniel's security system, or used photo editing software." He reached across the table for her hand. "I'm worried about Daniel too, but bringing ghost stories into it isn't helping." At the hospital later that morning, they found Daniel sitting up eating breakfast. His color had improved dramatically. "Good news," he announced as they entered. "All the tests came back normal. They're releasing me this afternoon, though I can't drive for a while because of the seizure." Relief flooded through Margaret. As James discussed discharge details with Daniel, she stepped into the hallway to call Patricia. 20 minutes later, she ended the call, her hands shaking slightly. Patricia's husband had indeed known about the Thorndikes, more than Margaret had anticipated. William Thorndike had been a significant figure in Boston's history, not just for his banking empire, but for his interest in the occult. After losing his son to influenza, he became obsessed with spiritualism, Patricia had explained. There were rumors he conducted seances in his Beacon Hill home, trying to contact Edward. The Boston Society papers never mentioned it directly, of course, but it was quite the scandal in certain circles. That evening, with Daniel safely installed in their hotel suite for monitoring, "Seriously, Mom, this is overkill." Margaret sat at the desk with her laptop, diving deeper into the Thorndike history. She found digitized journals from the Boston Historical Society mentioning William Thorndike's collection of books on necromancy and spirit photography. One entry noted that after the deaths of 3 family members in rapid succession, William had sold his Beacon Hill home at a significant loss and moved the remaining family to New York, where he lived as a recluse until his death in 1930. A search for Thorndike Boston spirit photography led her to an obscure paranormal research blog. The most recent post, dated just 2 weeks earlier, featured a headline that made Margaret's blood run cold. "The Thorndike Curse, When the Dead Return to Claim the Living." The article contained a grainy reproduction of what appeared to be the same family portrait Margaret had found, though the quality was poor. The blogger, someone calling themselves Paranormal Historian, claimed to have discovered the image in an estate sale and was researching its background. According to local legend, the post read, the Thorndike family became victims of a phenomenon known as death echoing, where the deceased returned to claim blood relatives. The portrait supposedly captures the moment when young Edward Thorndike, dead for 6 years, manifested to mark those he would soon collect. Margaret scrolled down to the comments section. There were only 3. "I've seen this phenomenon in other historical photos. Always children who died tragically. My great-grandmother knew the Thorndikes. The story in our family was that William Thorndike made a deal with something dark to see his son again." And the last comment, posted just 3 days ago, "I've found another Thorndike portrait with the dead child. Holloway branch of the family. Anyone have contact info for Margaret Holloway?" With trembling fingers, she clicked on the username, Thorndike Truth. The profile was nearly empty, created only a week earlier, with no identifying information. She typed a private message. "This is Margaret Holloway. How do you know my name? What portrait are you referring to?" While waiting for a response, she searched her maiden name, Chadwick, along with Thorndike. Nothing significant appeared. Her grandmother Elizabeth had been born a Thorndike, but Margaret had never thought of herself as connected to that family line. Her phone rang, startling her. It was her mother, Ruth. "Margaret, is Daniel all right? I've been trying to reach you." "He's fine, Mom. Had some kind of seizure, but the tests are clear. How did you know something happened?" A pause. "I had a dream last night. I saw Daniel standing at the end of a hospital corridor, and behind him a small boy with a grey face." Ruth's voice quavered. "You found something, didn't you? About the photograph?" Margaret told her about the research, the Thorndike's connection to spiritualism, and the blog post mentioning her name. "It's following you now," Ruth whispered, "just like it followed them." Mum, I don't believe in curses or ghosts. There has to be a rational explanation." "Did you destroy the photograph like I told you?" Margaret hesitated. "No, it's at home in Boston." "Listen to me very carefully," Ruth said, her voice suddenly stronger. "The only way to break this is to destroy every copy of that image, every physical copy, every digital copy. As long as Edward's image exists, he can find you." After ending the call, Margaret checked the paranormal blog again. Thorndike Truth had responded, "Meet me tomorrow, South Garden Art Institute, noon. I have information that can save your son." Margaret's instinct was to dismiss this as some kind of scam or prank, but the mention of saving Daniel gave her pause. What if there was even a slight chance this person knew something that could help? She didn't mention the meeting to James or Daniel. The next day, claiming she needed fresh air, Margaret took a taxi to the Art Institute of Chicago. The South Garden was busy with tourists and locals enjoying the unseasonably warm autumn day. Margaret sat on a bench near the fountain, scanning the crowds. At precisely noon, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Look at the woman with the red scarf, East Entrance." A slender, elderly woman with a bright red scarf wrapped around her neck stood watching Margaret from across the garden. As their eyes met, the woman nodded once and began walking slowly toward a quieter corner of the garden. Margaret followed, maintaining a safe distance and staying in public view. The woman appeared to be in her 80s, with steel-grey hair cut in a stylish bob. She carried herself with the poised dignity of old money. "Mrs. Holloway," the woman said as Margaret approached. Her voice was cultured with the faint traces of a Boston accent. "I'm Eleanor Caldwell. My grandmother was Sophia Thorndyke, William's sister." "You're Thorndyke Truth? How did you find me?" Eleanor gestured to a nearby bench. Once seated, she opened her handbag and withdrew a small envelope. "I've been tracking the Thorndyke curse for 60 years. When items from the family estate started appearing at auctions recently, I monitored them closely." She handed Margaret the envelope. Inside was a brittle newspaper clipping from 1957. "Thorndyke descendant takes own life." The accompanying photograph showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Margaret herself. "That was my cousin Catherine," Eleanor said softly. "She found a Thorndyke family photograph in her mother's things. 3 weeks later, she was dead. Before she died, she reported seeing a child with a grey face in her apartment." Margaret felt cold despite the sunshine. "This is insane." "Perhaps. But insanity doesn't explain how I found you." Eleanor fixed Margaret with a penetrating stare. "I saw your name in my dream 3 nights ago. Edward showed me your face and told me you had awakened him." "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to consider the evidence before you." Eleanor's voice hardened. "Your son had an unexplained seizure. You've received threatening messages, and I, a complete stranger, knew exactly who you were and where to find you." She leaned closer. "The Thorndyke curse is real, Margaret, and now it's focused on your family." "The photograph is a tether," Eleanor had explained. "A doorway he can use to cross over. But blood is stronger than paper and chemicals. He's connected to you now, through your bloodline, back to the Thorndykes." As ridiculous as it sounded, Margaret couldn't dismiss the mounting coincidences. Back at the hotel, she found James and Daniel watching a baseball game, both looking more relaxed than they had in days. "How was your walk?" James asked. "Fine. Just needed to clear my head." Margaret hesitated, then asked, "Daniel, have you had any unusual dreams lately, before the seizure?" Daniel glanced away quickly. Too quickly. "Not really." "Why?" "Just something Mom mentioned. She said she had a strange dream about you." Daniel muted the television. "Actually, I've been having this recurring nightmare for a couple of months. That's why the doctor prescribed the meds you found." He took a deep breath. "There's this kid with a really messed up face who stands at the foot of my bed, just watching me. I can never move or scream, just lie there while he stares." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. "What does he look like?" "This child. Pale, greyish skin, dark circles around his eyes, wearing old-fashioned clothes." Daniel shuddered. "It sounds stupid saying it out loud, but in the dreams I'm absolutely terrified." James looked between them, his expression growing concerned. "What's going on, Margaret?" She took out her phone and showed Daniel the photograph of Edward Thorndyke. "Is this the child from your dreams?" Daniel's face drained of color. "How did you—" "That's him. That's exactly him." "What the hell, Mom?" Margaret explained everything, finding the photograph, her mother's warnings, the research into the Thorndyke family, and finally, her meeting with Eleanor Caldwell. "This is madness," James said when she'd finished. You can't seriously believe some ghost from 100 years ago is targeting Daniel because of an old photograph. I don't know what to believe anymore, Margaret admitted, but the coincidences are becoming hard to ignore. Daniel had been silent, staring at the image of Edward on Margaret's phone. I've never seen this photograph before today, he said slowly. So how could I dream about him for months? That night, Margaret sat alone in the hotel bathroom, reading William Thorndyke's journal by the harsh fluorescent light. Most entries were rambling accounts of failed séances and spiritual theories, but one passage from September 1924 stood out. Success beyond imagining tonight. Edward appeared visibly to all present. Mrs. Harrington's camera captured his image, proving this was no mass hallucination. My son has returned. The blood offering opened the door, just as Madame Volkovich promised it would. I would sacrifice 1,000 souls to keep that door open. Margaret closed the journal, her hands shaking. Blood offering. A chill ran through her as she recalled what Eleanor had said about the severance ritual. It required the blood of a family member to close the door that William had opened. A crash from the bedroom jolted her from these dark thoughts. She rushed out to find Daniel on the floor beside his bed, his body rigid, eyes rolled back, foam at the corners of his mouth. Another seizure, more violent than the first. James was already calling for an ambulance. As Margaret knelt beside her son, trying to protect his head from hitting the floor, she saw something that made her heart nearly stop. A small grey handprint on Daniel's throat, as if someone had grabbed him with cold, dead fingers. We're transferring him to the neurology department for more specialized care, the attending physician explained. But I want to be honest with you, we're not sure what's causing this. As Daniel was wheeled away for yet another scan, Margaret sat beside James in the waiting room, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She hadn't told him about the grey handprint she'd seen on Daniel's neck, a mark that had vanished by the time the paramedics arrived. Nor had she mentioned the severance ritual Eleanor had described. "James," she said quietly, "what if Eleanor Caldwell is right? What if this is connected to the Thorndyke photograph?" James rubbed his face wearily. "Margaret, please. Our son is seriously ill. This isn't the time for ghost stories." "Look at the facts," Margaret insisted. "Daniel has been dreaming about Edward for months. He recognized him immediately from a photograph he'd never seen. The seizures started right after we found that portrait, and now the doctors can't explain what's happening to him." "Correlation isn't causation," James replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The strain of watching their son's inexplicable decline had cracked his rational facade. Margaret took his hand. "I need to try something. It might seem crazy, but if there's even a chance it could help Daniel." "What are you talking about?" She showed him Eleanor's instructions for the severance ritual. James read through them, his expression changing from skepticism to disbelief. "Blood magic, burning photographs at midnight. Margaret, this is medieval superstition." "I know how it sounds. But what if it works? What do we have to lose?" James stared at her for a long moment. "Our dignity, our rationality, our sense that the world operates according to comprehensible laws of nature. And if we do nothing? If Daniel keeps having seizures while the doctors scratch their heads?" Margaret's voice broke. "I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try everything." That evening, Margaret called her mother from the hospital room where Daniel lay sleeping, connected to monitors that beeped softly in the dim light. "I need you to do something for me," Margaret said without preamble. "Go to our house. The photograph is in my desk drawer in the study. Take it and burn it, tonight." "It won't be enough," Ruth replied. "Not if he's already attached himself to Daniel." "I know. Eleanor Caldwell gave me instructions for a severance ritual. James thinks I'm losing my mind, but he's agreed to help." Ruth was silent for a moment. "Be careful, Margaret. William Thorndyke thought he could control these forces too. Look what happened to his family." After ending the call, Margaret turned to find James, standing in the doorway, his face pale in the half-light. "I called the lab about Daniel's latest results," he said. "They found something unusual in his blood work. Some kind of protein they can't identify. They're running more tests." Margaret felt a cold certainty settling over her. "It's him, Edward. He's inside Daniel somehow." James didn't argue this time. He simply said, "What do we need for this ritual?" At midnight, they locked the door to Daniel's private room. Hospital staff had been told they were praying and needed privacy. On the small rolling table beside Daniel's bed, they arranged the items Eleanor had specified. A silver bowl, actually stainless steel, the best they could find, a small bottle of alcohol, a red candle, and a printed copy of the Thorndyke photograph Margaret had emailed to herself. "This is insane," James muttered, but he followed Margaret's instructions, helping position the items correctly. Margaret took a deep breath and began reciting the words Eleanor had written down, an odd mixture of Latin phrases and English declarations. As she spoke, the monitors attached to Daniel began to fluctuate, his heart rate increasing slightly. "Blood of the family must sever the bond," Margaret read. She took a sterilized needle they'd obtained from a nurse and pricked her finger, allowing several drops of blood to fall into the bowl. "By my blood, descendant of Thorndykes, I reclaim what was taken." James followed suit, adding his blood to hers. "By my bond to this family, I stand against the intrusion." The final step required blood from Daniel himself. Margaret gently took her son's hand and, with trembling fingers, pricked his index finger. A single drop of blood fell into the bowl, mingling with theirs. "By blood and fire, we close the door," Margaret recited, her voice steadier now. She lit the red candle and held the printed photograph over its flame. "What was opened in blood is now sealed in blood. Edward Thorndyke, return to your rest. Your time among the living is done." The photograph caught fire, curling and blackening. Margaret dropped it into the silver bowl, where it continued to burn, giving off an acrid smell. The hospital room's smoke detector should have activated, but it remained silent, as if even the electronic systems recognized something unnatural was occurring. As the photograph burned completely, Daniel's monitors suddenly began to wail. His body arched off the bed, eyes flying open but seeing nothing, his mouth opened in a silent scream. "Daniel!" James lunged forward, but Margaret held him back. "Wait," she whispered. "Look." A grey mist seemed to be rising from Daniel's skin, gathering above him in the dimly lit room. The mist twisted and coalesced, gradually taking on a human shape, the unmistakable silhouette of a small child. The temperature in the room plummeted. Margaret's breath clouded in front of her face as she stared at the spectral form hovering above her son. Within the mist, two dark hollows appeared where eyes should be, fixing on Margaret with a terrible awareness. "Edward," she said, forcing strength into her voice, "you must go. This is not your family. This is not your time." The misty figure drifted closer to her. Margaret felt an overwhelming wave of loneliness and grief, emotions not her own, but projected from the entity before her. For a moment she saw not a malevolent spirit, but a confused, frightened child, lost between worlds. "I understand you're lonely," Margaret said softly. "I understand you miss your family, but you can't stay here. You can't take my son to keep you company." The spirit wavered, seeming to consider her words. Then, with a sudden, violent movement, it rushed toward Margaret, its form elongating into something no longer childlike, but monstrous. James shouted in alarm, trying to pull Margaret away, but she stood firm. "By the blood of your family, I command you to depart," Margaret shouted, holding up the silver bowl with the ashes of the photograph and their mingled blood. "Return to your rest, Edward Thorndyke." The entity recoiled as if struck. It writhed in the air above them, its form stretching and distorting. A high-pitched keening filled the room, though Margaret couldn't tell if the sound was audible or somehow resonating directly in her mind. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the grey mist dispersed, dissolving into nothingness. The temperature in the room returned to normal, Daniel's monitors stabilized, showing strong, regular heartbeats and normal brain activity. Margaret and James stood frozen, staring at the empty air where the entity had been. After a moment, Daniel stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Mum, Dad?" he murmured, his voice weak but clear. "What happened?" Margaret collapsed into the chair beside his bed, grasping his hand. "You're going to be okay now," she said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Everything's going to be okay." Daniel had fully recovered, with no memory of the seizures or the entity that had possessed him. He remembered the dreams of the grey-faced boy, but said they felt distant now, like trying to recall a movie seen long ago. The original Thorndyke family portrait had been destroyed by Ruth, exactly as Margaret had instructed. All digital copies had been deleted, though Margaret had preserved detailed written descriptions for her research. She'd also maintained contact with Eleanor Caldwell, whose knowledge of the Thorndyke history had proved invaluable. "You've become quite the paranormal investigator," James remarked from the doorway, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He set one on her desk and pulled up a chair beside her. Over the months, his skepticism had softened into a kind of cautious openness. He still sought rational explanations, but no longer dismissed possibilities that fell outside conventional understanding. "I prefer historical researcher," Margaret replied with a smile. "It sounds more respectable." James glanced at the papers spread across her desk. "Have you found any other cases like ours?" 3 definite ones, all connected to old photographs, where deceased individuals appeared unexpectedly. Eleanor believes there are many more that went undocumented. Margaret sipped her tea thoughtfully. The common thread seems to be a deep attachment, someone who couldn't let go of a loved one who died, like William Thorndyke with Edward. Exactly. His journal entries make it clear he was obsessed with bringing Edward back. He apparently worked with a medium, this Madame Volkovich, who taught him a ritual to open what she called the door between worlds. James frowned. "But why would Edward try to harm Daniel? A child wouldn't—" "I don't think it was really Edward anymore," Margaret interrupted. "Not the child he had been. Whatever came through that door may have started as Edward, but it changed, became something that fed on life energy, drawing the living toward death." She shuddered slightly at the memory of the distorted mist hovering above Daniel's hospital bed. "And now, do you think it's truly gone?" Margaret considered the question. "I believe the connection is severed. The photograph was the original anchor, and we've broken that link." She didn't add that sometimes, in her dreams, she still sensed a presence watching from shadowed corners. Not threatening, but waiting. Some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from Thorndyke Truth, Eleanor Caldwell's account. "Margaret," the message read, "I've located another branch of the family in Providence. They have photographs, history repeating. Can you come?" James read the message over her shoulder. "Are you going?" Margaret thought about Daniel, healthy and thriving again, about the family in Providence who might be experiencing the same terrifying phenomena, about the countless undocumented cases Eleanor believed existed. "Yes," she said finally, "I have to. I understand this now in a way few people do." James nodded, taking her hand. "Then I'm coming with you." As Margaret began packing her research materials, her gaze fell on a family photograph taken last Christmas. Before any of this began, she and James flanking their 2 adult children, all smiling into the camera. A perfectly normal family portrait. But now she knew better than most how deceiving photographs could be, how they could capture not just light and shadow, but sometimes things that existed in the spaces between worlds, things that waited for an invitation, for someone desperate enough to open a door better left closed. Margaret slipped the Christmas photo into a folder, then paused. For just a moment, she thought she'd seen something in the background, a small, indistinct figure standing in the shadows behind her family. But when she looked again, there was nothing there, just a trick of the light. Or perhaps a reminder that some stories, like some photographs, were never truly finished.